Hello to this new feature on the channel where I'm going to try and explain some racing concepts using a bit of visuals and some plain speaking to try to decode a little bit of what's going on in the world of racing. And with F1 and the World Endurance Championship testing coming up, I thought I would get into how to professionally evaluate testing or how I would do it given only the information that's available to the public. We can take a huge amount from how our favourite teams or drivers are doing in testing, but only if considered with the proper consideration to the various factors going on and qualified properly. So without further ado, here is how to analyse testing. So there are three factors that teams are in general looking for throughout the testing process. Those factors are the peak pace over one lap, the race pace over a sequential series of laps, and the reliability of their car over the full testing process. So let's get into them one by one and try to evaluate how we could get a feel as an onlooker for how well they're doing at these various things. So the peak pace of the cars is the most widely reported element of testing. And that's because we would tend to get the best lap that all the cars have done by session, AM and PM, or by day, delivered to us, the audience, through the mass media. But that really doesn't mean a lot without qualifying it against what the circuit conditions were when those particular laps were done. There are several factors which affect the conditions under which laps are completed in, and it's important to understand these factors to get a proper feel for what those lap times mean. So firstly, let's look at the circuit factors. The circuit factors can come down to mainly temperature, the development of the track surface, and also the wind direction. So let's look at those one by one. Firstly, the temperature. In general, race cars go slower the hotter it is, and quicker the cooler it is. And that's mainly because of three things. Firstly, engine performance is slightly better with cooler air temperature. That's because the air is more dense, therefore has a little bit more oxygen in it, which is what is effectively being burned in the engine along with the fuel. Add to that greater oxygen content, greater fuel, which the engine will do automatically through its engine control unit, and you get a bigger bang and therefore a little bit more power. Because of this slightly denser air, the cars, if they are producing downforce, which most global level racing cars are, will also produce a little bit more downforce. Again, the air flowing over the wings and through the venturis of a car is slightly more dense when the air is cooler. And therefore, you gain a little bit more from each aerodynamic plane or each aerodynamic effect, because effectively the air is just that little bit thicker and more soupy and pushes the car down towards the road. Tyre performance is also slightly better in general on a cooler circuit surface. And that's because a lot of the negative effects on tyre performance are due to tyre surfaces overheating as they meet the surface of the racetrack. It's one thing which tyre manufacturers and teams work hard to mitigate. In general, a cooler track condition can also offer teams the opportunity to run a softer tyre, which in turn will provide a better peak lap time. Then we need to consider the wind direction. Over a qualifying session or a shorter session, we can generally expect that the wind direction is going to remain relatively static. But over a full day of testing, the wind direction can change 180 degrees. How does that affect the peak pace? Well, it really depends on exactly the circuit that you're running on. So let's take, for example, a racetrack like Barcelona, which is a key test track for various major series. If you have the wind heading in the direction of a tailwind down the front straight, and then a headwind on the curves back towards that front straight, in general that will make the whole circuit quicker. That's because the terminal speed down the front straight is going to be improved by the tailwind, and then the cars are going to receive a greater amount of downforce functionality as they head into the headwind, because the wind moving over the top of the car makes all of those downforce elements perform better. Effectively, what you're doing is almost a natural drag reduction system. So you're reducing drag where the cars want to in a straight line, and then you're adding drag and downforce where the cars need it to turn in the middle and the final sector. Let's flip that wind around and say we have the front straight as a headwind and then a tailwind all the way through the middle sector. Well, then we have the reverse effect. So we're gaining drag down the front straight and then losing downforce in the middle sector. So these two wind directions have changed not only the characteristics of the car, but also the general speed of the racetrack. In fact, it has made the circuit faster or slower, depending on the directionality of the wind. So we can generally consider that a circuit is moving forward in a relatively linear way. And I'm going to give you some tips in a minute to try to mitigate these differences. So it doesn't necessarily matter to us watching on exactly how much the circuits move forward, just the understanding that every lap done throughout several days of testing is only relative to the laps which are being done at a similar time. So taking that into consideration, let's look at some strategies to try to mitigate these factors in understanding the peak laps and how they're relative to each other. So what we're going to try and do when we look at testing as a sequence of lap times is perhaps also read the report that goes along with those times and try and get a feel for not only the lap times that were set, but the sequential order in which they were set. We can then look to compare laps that were done at a similar time of day to the laps which we're comparing them against, and that should give us a feel for where those certain competitors are at. If you do have the time to watch the testing sessions, either through the feed or on live timing, that'll give you a much better feel, and you would only really ever work in around 15-20 minute intervals in terms of comparable lap times that are of a similar time period and delivered in similar conditions. If you don't have time to watch the full test day, which, let's face it, not very many of us do, I would suggest setting one of your devices to screen record the live timing of the test day that you are interested in. What you can then do is search through and look for the moment at which those lap times were delivered and compare the times at which those lap times were delivered. If you get a really good live timing system, you can also have a look at the wind direction and the temperature at those times if it's delivered on the same screen, or perhaps compare back to the recording of the temperature and the wind speed to give you a feel for whether those laps are relative or not. Let's look at the car factors that also affect performance, and one of those car factors is the tyre compound on which those peak laps are done. So during qualifying and racing, teams will almost always use the tyre compound which is most beneficial to them, either in its longevity or in terms of qualifying in its peak performance. They would tend to go for the softest possible compound of tyre to take that one lap pace. In testing, however, sometimes even on their peak lap, teams are evaluating tyres that are entirely unsuitable for the racetrack on which they're delivering the testing process. So we need to get a feel for what the compound of tyre difference is between a set of cars that have both delivered laps. In order to do that, what we can do is go and look back at comparable races. It's almost certain that at some point the series that you're looking at have raced on the racetrack at which they're now testing. Series are extremely unlikely to go and use a test track for their official tests where live timing is available that is not on their series calendar. What you can then do is go and look back at lap times delivered, for example, in qualifying or free practice, or indeed to the information of the tyre supplier, for example, Pirelli in Formula One, and see what the gap is in terms of those two tyres. You can then apply that to the difference in lap time of laps delivered at a similar time on the test day to give you a feel for how those drivers have performed relatively against each other. So let's get on to the crunchy subject of fuel loads. And it's a crunchy subject because it's almost impossible to tell how much fuel is in the various cars at any one time. But as with the rest of this video, if we're only presented with the information that the public might receive, there are a couple of ways, if we're focusing on a specific driver or team, we can get a pretty good feel for how much fuel about they're running. The first one is by looking at the run plan, particularly in single-seater racing, which is an area where single-seater racing diverts from endurance racing. And that's because single-seater race cars have to be put back into the garage in order to fill or remove fuel from them. So let's imagine our driver that we're following does a relatively long run, 15 to 20 laps, and then comes in, stops in the box, changes the tyres and goes directly out for a much shorter performance run. We can gather from that that the car has not been refilled with fuel in that stoppage time. And so that gives us an indication that the amount of fuel that the car was carrying when it did the peak pace run was relatively low. Instead, now let's consider a different run plan, which is often used by teams in single-seater racing, where a car does a routine number of laps, stops, gets pushed into the garage, and then comes out again with perhaps a different setup or a different compound of tyre, and then heads out for another routine period of laps. That's another different type of testing strategy that teams often use. And that testing strategy is often done with a medium to high fuel load. What they're trying to do in that case is actually keep the fuel load as static as possible, to take it away as a variable as the team try different downforce elements or different suspension settings on the car. So in general, where we see a vast difference in the length of runs with short stops in between, that's where we're going to expect in single-seater racing, at some point, the driver is running a lighter fuel load. Where we see routine stint lengths with relatively long stops in between, that's where we're going to be expecting that drivers are running a slightly heavier fuel load. Again, we have no way of knowing exactly how much fuel teams are running in the car, but with a bit of deductive reasoning and a look at the sequence of laps which are being achieved by the drivers, we can make a deductive guess, which is about as well as we're going to be able to do from the sidelines in the testing process. In terms of understanding fuel loads run by endurance teams or teams where refueling is allowed in their motorsport program, it is pretty much impossible, I'll be honest. Unless you're following one team and watching them plug in the fuel hose and literally counting the number of seconds with an understanding of the fuel flow rate, there's really no way to understand exactly how much fuel is in any car at any one time. What I would say though, is that in terms of their peak pace, endurance teams or teams outside Formula One are generally working to a relatively tight tyre limit, meaning that there are only really 2 or 3 phases throughout the day. Let's say, for example, in the World Endurance Championship, where you're granted 3 sets of tyres per day of testing, where you can actually set a peak lap time. And teams are unlikely to squander those by running vast amounts of fuel in the car. Equally, in endurance racing series, which is where fueling is generally allowed, as much as it sounds a bit like a cop-out, the peak pace of the car is not necessarily as an important evaluation tool for us to consider in terms of how well our team might actually do in the championship. It's also a smaller component factor of the weight of the car. So let's say the car weighs 1,200 kilos rather than 800 kilos. The 100 kilos of fuel which is going to be added is a smaller percentage of the car's total weight, and therefore affects the car less in comparison to a formula where the cars are lighter. Let's look at race pace now and think through how teams might evaluate their own race pace in comparison to the competition. The first thing to say about race pace is it's not immune to the same effects as the one lap pace. But in general, race pace, because drivers are operating on warm tyres with compromises to the setup to allow the car to do lap on lap on lap, will generally be affected less by changes in track condition in comparison to the qualifying speed of the car. In general, we would analyse race pace as an average of an over 10 lap run completed on a relevant tyre at a relevant time. So we take two drivers, we look at the run which they've completed, and then we take an average of the laps which they've done throughout that run and look at the average lap time that they've done and see if in general this driver is faster than that one. Those averages, though, are skewed by the reality of testing, which is that the cars are not actually in a race, they're simulating a race, meaning that so often teams and drivers move out from the toe or the aerodynamic wash of other drivers, or indeed slow the car down to gather data for other things. That means that when we look at these race runs, we need to exclude any laps which fall outside a certain standard deviation. So let's say a driver's done 10 laps, but they've backed off for traffic on lap 4, we would exclude that from our average pace. We can also watch the cars closely through the race runs to gain an idea of the tendency of the cars. And how we do that is by sector analysis, lap on lap, to see where the cars are fast and where the cars are slow. Let's go back to Barcelona again to get a feel for that. So in general, Barcelona will have a front straight and a first sector which remains relatively static between all types of degradation of tyre as the tyre falls away and the grip of the drivers is reduced. But in sector 3, you get a real feel for how the performance of the tyre falls away. And that's because the corners require a lot of mechanical grip from the car. The slow, twisty turns of the final sector requiring teams and drivers to keep the tyre underneath them and specifically, in this case, keep the rear tyre cool. So through our race runs, if we're looking specifically at which cars may struggle with tyre degradation through the year, we might look only at the evolution of time in sector 3, giving us the best chance to understand the cars while limiting the number of variables that can affect that understanding. Finally, let's have a look at reliability and how we might evaluate that besides the obvious over a weekend or 3 days of testing. So initially, you can obviously read the reports and see if there are any significant issues with engines, gearboxes or other parts that have plagued a team through testing. And if teams are struggling with those kind of issues and out for a long time, they tend to be communicative with the media about what those issues are. But you can also deduce more deeply by watching testing closely if teams are struggling with their reliability. And there are several ways you can do that. Testing processes are really well choreographed by race teams, and they get very limited testing in these major series, especially at venues with their new cars or cars for the current year with everybody else around as a benchmark. So teams will very unlikely waste significant amounts of time on these days. So if you see a team stopped at any point for over an hour without an obvious reason why, then it's relatively clear that they're having some sort of mechanical issue with the car. Sometimes teams change floors and larger pieces of aerodynamic equipment or major bits of suspension equipment during days, but more often than not, the most efficient usage of a race team's time is to change those things during a lunch break or indeed overnight between sessions of testing. So it's really unlikely you're going to see the car in bits, especially at those key moments in testing and especially when the circuit is at its best. That's also clear and something you can deduce from the timing screens when a team have a time for a session or for a day which is simply miles off the pace. This so often means that the team have had a mechanical issue during happy hour, and that's time that they would normally be out there on the racetrack gaining the best track conditions. So if a team are simply seconds off the pace, it's almost certain that they've missed the better time on track due to an inability to be out on the race circuit rather than the lack of desire to perform. Equally, because of how well these test plans are choreographed, teams have very little to actually react to over a day of testing. They don't have to rush for the rain or the change of conditions. They don't have to rush for safety cars or, even to get better track position in terms of red flags. They're simply in open pit lane running and therefore can plan the day to their absolute optimum. That means if when watching testing feeds, you ever see cars arrive in the pit lane to a seemingly unexpected team, or you ever see a team rush to scrabble the car back into the garage, the only real reason why they would do that is normally due to a mechanical failure. So if you see any panic whatsoever during a professional race team's testing process, reliability is really the only reason why you might see that level of stress. Then of course, the most obvious one, we look at lap count. There is almost a direct comparison, a direct proportionality between the number of laps completed by a team and their reliability over the season to come. So I really hope you enjoyed that look into the intricacies of trying to understand testing. I'm going to leave you with 3 rules of thumb to get the most out of understanding the testing process. Firstly, the gold standard of comparing 2 cars or drivers in testing is when they're on track on the same compound at the same time. That is an absolutely fair comparison, and if they're on a similar run plan, they might well be on the same fuel load as well. If you're unable to do that because the team's run plans won't allow it, and let's face it, they very seldom do, we can get a good estimate of how the teams are performing by applying some modifiers to the eventual lap times to give us a feel for about how well the cars are comparing. Look for moments throughout the test where the team look out of sorts or drivers look out of control, on track or in the pit lane. There should be absolutely no surprises in testing. If they're looking out of control in testing, then it's a really good chance that when the chips are down and the pressure's on, then the team are going to struggle a lot. Those 2 things should hopefully add to your understanding and enjoyment of getting a feel for how the packages are shaping up for this season's racing.